The salt air of the Atlantic pushed against the French doors of my study, carrying the scent of expensive perfume and imported lilies. I am Arthur Sterling. I am 68 years old, and for decades, I have operated on the broken bodies of the most powerful people in America. You don't spend 40 years as a chief of cardiothoracic surgery without learning how to read a person's vitals before they even speak. You learn to spot the slight tremor in a hand, the dilation of a pupil, the rhythm of a lie dot, and for months, I have been watching my son-in-law, Julian, prepare to dissect my life while I was still breathing. Tonight was supposed to be the pinnacle of a life well lived. It was my 40th wedding anniversary. Outside the study, the ballroom of the Montauk Point Country Club was a sea of white roses and shimmering silver ribbons. The elite of the New York medical and financial world were there, over 100 guests sipping vintage Krug and discussing the stock market. They were there to celebrate the great Arthur Sterling and his beautiful wife, Catherine. I stood at the window, adjusting my silk bootie. Catherine, still breathtaking at 65, was already out there, playing the perfect hostess. She wore a floor-length emerald gown that our daughter, Victoria, had picked out for her. Catherine didn't know. I had purposely kept her in the dark. I needed her smiles to be real. I needed her warmth to be the contrast to the cold-blooded betrayal that was about to unfold. A knock came at the door. I didn't turn around. I knew the cadence of that knock. Arthur, everyone is asking for the man of the hour. It was Julian. He stepped into the room, looking every bit the successful Manhattan wealth manager he claimed to be. His suit was bespoke, his hair perfectly coiffed, and his smile was a masterpiece of manufactured sincerity. "I'll be out in a moment, Julian," I said, my voice as steady as it was when I held a scalpel. Just taking a moment to reflect. 40 years is a long time. It's an eternity, Arthur, Julian said, walking further into the room. He leaned against my mahogany desk, the desk where I kept the files that would eventually end him. Most men your age are already slowed down, resting. You've built an empire. You deserve to let someone else carry the heavy lifting now. We talked about this, we did, I replied. Cognitive health, estate transition, the inevitable decline. Julian nodded, his eyes shining with a predatory greed he thought he was hiding. Exactly, it's about protection. Victoria and I just want to make sure you and Catherine are taken care of before things get foggy. I finally turned to look at him. He was 32, polished and utterly hollow. I remembered the day he married Victoria 3 years ago. I had seen the red flags then, the way he looked at our house more than his bride, the way he constantly pivoted conversations toward my investments. But Victoria had been so happy, or so I thought. Where is Victoria? I asked. She's with Madeline, Julian said, referring to his mother, helping her with the seating arrangements. Victoria has been a bit stressed lately, Arthur. This party has taken a lot out of her. I knew why she was stressed. For 2 years, my daughter, the girl I had taught to ride a bike, the woman who had followed my footsteps into science, had been changing. She had become thin, her eyes darting and anxious. She had stopped visiting for Sunday brunch. She had become a ghost in her own life, haunted by the man standing in front of me. Let's go then, I said. We shouldn't keep the guests waiting. As we walked toward the ballroom, the sound of a string quartet grew louder. The doors swung open and the room erupted in applause. It was a beautiful lie. I scanned the room. In the far corner, near the bar, sat Marcus Thorne. He looked like just another guest in a tuxedo, but he was the private investigator I had hired in March. He caught my eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. The cameras were live. The microphones were active. I saw Madeline, Julian's mother, standing near the head table. She was a sharp-featured woman who wore her jewelry like armor. Beside her was Victoria. My heart ached when I saw her. She looked fragile, her smile failing to reach her eyes. She looked at me, and for a split second, I saw a flash of pure, unadulterated terror. She knew what Julian had in his pocket. She knew what was planned for the toast. Arthur, Catherine, a voice boomed. It was Dr. Richard Vance, my oldest friend and former best man. He grabbed my shoulder, his face flushed with genuine joy. 40 years, you old dog. I still remember the night you met her at the fundraiser. In '84. I remember it too, Richard, I said, leaning in close. I'm going to need a favor later. A toast. A long one. I'll give you the signal. Richard's brow furrowed, but he saw the look in my eyes, the operating room look. He nodded slowly. Whatever you need, Arthur. I moved through the crowd, shaking hands, accepting congratulations from people who had no idea they were about to witness a public execution. I kept my eyes on the champagne table. Julian was there now. He was talking to a waiter, gesturing toward two specific crystal flutes that had been set apart on a silver tray. He thought the large floral centerpiece of white lilies blocked the view of the room. He didn't know that I had installed a pinhole camera in the molding of the ceiling 3 days ago. I watched him. His back was to the crowd. His right hand reached into his tuxedo jacket. With the practiced grace of a magician, he pulled out a small amber vial. He tapped a single white tablet into one of the glasses. It hissed for a microsecond as it dissolved into the expensive bubbles. Haloperidol, a potent antipsychotic. In a man my age, it would cause immediate confusion, slurred speech, and loss of motor control. To a room full of doctors, it would look like a massive stroke or the sudden onset of acute dementia. It was the smoking gun Julian needed to trigger the emergency guardianship papers he already had signed by a corrupt doctor named Harrison Wells. Julian picked up the tray. He was smiling. It was the same smile he had used when he asked for my daughter's hand in marriage. Ladies and gentlemen, Julian shouted, his voice commanding the room. The music died down. 200 pairs of eyes turned toward us. If I could have everyone's attention for the toast of the century. He began walking toward me, the poisoned glass glistening under the chandeliers. He was confident. He thought he was the smartest person in the room. He was about to find out that you never try to outmaneuver a man who has spent 40 years cutting people open to see what's inside. The ballroom fell into a hushed, expectant silence. 200 of the most influential people in the state stood still, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the massive crystal chandeliers. Julian stood at the center of the floor, the silver tray in his hand reflecting the light like a weapon. He looked like the perfect son-in-law, attentive, successful, and deeply moved by the occasion. 40 years, Julian began, his voice projecting with a practiced, cinematic warmth. They say that behind every great man is a great woman. But looking at Arthur and Catherine Sterling, I see something different. I see a partnership that has defined what it means to build a legacy. Arthur, you've spent your life saving others. Tonight, we celebrate the life you've built for yourself. He stepped closer to me. I could smell the faint scent of his expensive cologne, mixed with the metallic tang of the champagne. Beside me, Catherine squeezed my arm, her eyes misty with genuine emotion. She had no idea she was standing next to a man who had just been handed his own death warrant. In a crystal glass. Julian reached for the tray. With a steady hand, he offered me the glass on the left, the one I had seen him spike just moments before. To your health, Arthur. Too many more years of clarity. I took the glass. I felt the cold moisture of the condensation on my palm. I looked down into the golden liquid. Tiny bubbles rose to the surface, innocent and effervescent, hiding the chemical trap designed to erase my mind. I looked Julian directly in the eyes. I wanted to see if there was a flicker of hesitation, a shred of guilt. There was none, only the cold, hard stare of a man counting his money before the mark is even dead. Thank you, Julian, I said, my voice low and resonant. You've always been so attentive to my needs. He then handed the clean glass to Catherine. And to you, Catherine, the heart of this family. Now, Julian said, turning back to the crowd while holding his own glass, which he had picked up from a nearby table earlier. Before we drink, I believe Dr. Richard Vance has a few words to share about the early days of the Sterling legend. This was the cue. Richard stood up, his tall frame cutting an imposing figure, as he began a long-winded, emotional story about our residency days in 1984. The attention of the room shifted. 200 heads turned toward Richard. The spotlight followed him. In that moment, Julian relaxed. He thought the hard part was over. He stood just a foot away from me, his eyes on Richard, a smug smile playing on his lips. He held his own glass of clean champagne loosely by his side. I waited for the right beat in Richard's story the moment he mentioned a particularly hilarious mishap in there. The room erupted in a sudden wave of laughter. That was the window. I feigned a slight stumble, a momentary lapse in balance that an old man might naturally have. "Oh," I gasped softly, as I reached out to steady myself against the small cocktail table Julian was standing next to. My arm brushed against his hand. It was a surgical maneuver, fast, precise, and hidden by the movement of my tuxedo jacket. In the span of 2 seconds, under the cover of the crowd's laughter, I swapped the glasses. The movement was so fluid that Julian didn't even feel the weight change. I stepped back, adjusting my glasses, looking embarrassed. "Forgive me," I whispered loudly enough for Julian to hear. "The excitement is getting to my head." Clumsy old man. Julian didn't even look down at his hand. He gave a dismissive, patronizing pat on my shoulder. "Careful there, Arthur. Don't want you falling before the big finish." If only he knew. The poison was now in his hand. The cure was in mine. That Richard finished his toast with a booming command. "To Arthur and Catherine. To 40 years of excellence. To Arthur and Catherine." The room roared in unison. I watched Julian over the rim of my glass. He was eager. He wanted the drug to hit me fast so he could begin the next phase of his script. He tilted his head back and downed half the glass in one large gulp. I took a polite sip of the clean champagne. The crisp taste of the vintage grapes, a stark contrast to the bitterness I felt in my heart. We set our glasses down. The music resumed a soft jazz standard. Julian stayed close to me, his eyes tracking my face. He was waiting for the first sign. He was waiting for my eyelids to heavy, for my tongue to thicken, for the fog to set in. 60 seconds passed. I remained perfectly upright, smiling at a former colleague who had approached us. 90 seconds passed. I saw the first sign of change, but it wasn't in me. Julian's pupils began to dilate. A fine sheen of sweat broke out on his forehead. He blinked rapidly, shaking his head as if trying to clear a sudden blurriness. "Julian," I asked, my voice dripping with feigned concern, "are you all right, son? You look a bit pale." I'm fine," he muttered, but the F was soft, the N trailed off. His coordination was failing. He tried to take a step toward his mother, Madeline, but his left leg didn't follow the command of his brain. He swayed, his hand reaching out blindly for the table I had just used to destroy him. "Julian," Madeline's voice cut through the music. She had noticed. She rushed over, her face a mask of sudden panic. "What's wrong?" "Julian, look at me." He couldn't look at her. His head rolled back slightly. His breathing became labored. A heavy, rhythmic sound that I recognized instantly. It was the respiratory distress of a central nervous system under attack. He didn't fall fast. He crumbled. His knees hit the polished hardwood first. Then his torso slumped against the table, sending crystal glasses shattering to the floor. The sound of breaking glass acted like a starter's pistol. The room erupted into chaos. "Someone call 911. A woman screamed. I stood over him, my expression one of shocked grief. But as I looked down at his convulsing form, I saw Victoria. She had pushed through the crowd and was kneeling by her husband. She wasn't screaming like the others. She was staring at me. Her face was white, her lips trembling. In that look, the truth was laid bare. She knew what was supposed to happen to me tonight, and she realized, with a soul-crushing certainty, that I had known it too. "Dad," she whispered, the word barely audible over the sirens starting to wail in the distance. I didn't answer. I just watched the paramedics rush through the doors I had opened for them. The hunt was over. The surgery had begun. The Southampton Hospital emergency room was a place I knew better than my own living room. I had spent 35 years within these walls, making decisions that hovered between life and death. As the automatic doors hissed open, the familiar smell of antiseptic and floor wax hit me. Usually, it was a smell that brought me a sense of control. Tonight, it felt like a shroud. Julian was rushed into trauma room 2. The paramedics were shouting stats: heart rate 110, respiratory rate depressed, pupils non-reactive. I stood in the hallway, my tuxedo jacket feeling heavy and out of place. Catherine was being consoled by a nurse in the waiting area. She was in a state of pure shock, her hands trembling as she held a plastic cup of water. But my eyes were on Victoria. She was standing near the vending machines, her back to the wall. She wasn't crying. She was vibrating a low, rhythmic shaking that signaled a total internal collapse. She looked like a ghost of the girl she used to be, the Victoria I knew was a sharp, witty marketing executive with a laugh that could fill a stadium. This woman was a shell, hollowed out by 3 years of living with a predator. I walked toward her. My footsteps were silent on the linoleum. "Victoria," I said softly. She jumped, her head snapping up. When she saw me, her eyes filled with something I had never seen directed at me before. Fear. Not the fear of a daughter for her father's safety, but the fear of a criminal looking at her judge. Is he going to die?" she whispered. "No," I said, my voice clinical. "He took a high dose of an antipsychotic. His stomach will be pumped. He'll be put on N for drip. And he'll be conscious by morning. He's young. His heart is strong enough to survive his own poison." Victoria's breath hitched. She caught the word poison. She looked around to see if anyone was listening. "Dad, don't say that. It was an accident. Maybe the champagne was bad, or stop it, Victoria." I interrupted. The coldness in my voice surprised even me. "I am a doctor. I saw him drop the tablet. I saw the vial in his pocket, and I think you saw it, too." She looked away, her lip trembling. "You don't understand. Julian, he's in trouble, deep trouble. He lost everything in some bad trades last year. He owes people money, Dad. Dangerous people. He said if we didn't get control of the estate soon, they would come for us. They would come for me." "So the solution was to erase your father?" I asked. "To put me in a facility so you could pay off his gambling debts with the money I earned, at the cost of my sleep, my health, and my time with you? It wasn't supposed to be forever." She turned on me, a flash of her old fire returning, though it was twisted. "He said we'd just do it for a year, just long enough to fix the books. He said Dr. Wells would make sure you were comfortable. He said you were getting old anyway, that you were already starting to forget things." I felt a sharp pang in my chest, not a heart attack, but the feeling of a scalpel cutting through a memory. "I wasn't forgetting things, Victoria. Julian was drugging my coffee every Sunday for 3 months. That fog you saw, that wasn't age, that was your husband." Victoria froze. The color drained from her face until she was the shade of the hospital. "Tiles. He told me he was giving you supplements to help your memory. He lied to you, and you chose to believe the lie because it was easier than facing the truth," I said. "You were complicit, Victoria, whether through greed or weakness. You stood by and watched him try to kill my mind." Before she could respond, a young doctor emerged from the trauma ward. I recognized him, Dr. Reese, a bright kid I had mentored during his residency. He looked tired and confused. "Dr. Sterling," he said, nodding respectfully, "we've stabilized your son-in-law, but something is wrong. The blood work came back with massive levels of haloperidol. This isn't a typical overdose. Given the circumstances at the party, I've had to follow protocol." "And what is the protocol, David?" I asked, knowing the answer. "I've notified the police. Detective Miller is on her way. She'll want to speak to everyone who was near Julian's drink." I saw Victoria's hand fly to her mouth. She looked like she was about to vanish into the wall. "Thank you, David," I said. "You did the right thing." I turned back to my daughter. The little girl who used to help me plant tomatoes in the garden was gone. In her place was a woman who was about to face the consequences of a very dark choice. "Detective Miller is very thorough," I told her. "She's been working with me since March. She already has the recordings, Victoria. She has the surveillance from your house. She has the financial records Julian tried to hide." Victoria's eyes went wide. "Since March, you've known since March. A surgeon never enters the theater without a plan, Victoria. I knew someone was trying to cut me. I just had to make sure they were the ones who bled." I turned and walked toward Catherine, leaving Victoria alone in the hallway. I had saved my life tonight, but as I looked at my daughter's retreating form, I realized I had lost her long ago. The waiting room felt smaller as Detective Sarah Miller walked in. She didn't look like the Hollywood version of a detective. She wore a sensible navy blazer and had her gray-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun. Her eyes, however, were like laser levels perfectly calibrated to find the tilt in anyone's story. "Dr. Sterling," she said, shaking my hand firmly, "it seems your party went exactly according to the data we gathered." "Precisely," I replied, though I believe Julian found the vintage a bit more potent than he anticipated. Victoria was still standing by the wall, but she was no longer alone. Madeline had moved to her side. Madeline, the matriarch of a crumbling dynasty, was trying to maintain her composure, but her expensive silk scarf was wrinkled from her nervous tugging. "Detective," Madeline intercepted, her voice high and brittle, "this is all a terrible mistake. My son has been under immense stress. He must have reached for the wrong bottle. Or perhaps his own medication got mixed up." Detective Miller pulled a small digital tablet from her bag and tapped the screen. "Mrs. Callahan, we have high-definition footage from the ballroom ceiling. It shows your son taking a vial from his pocket, spiking a glass, and then quite ironically drinking from that same glass after a very clumsy swap." Madeline's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked like a fish gasping for air. "But that's not why I'm here for the long haul," Miller continued, her voice dropping into a lower, more predatory tone. "We're here because of the Wells Protocol." At the mention of that name, Madeline's face didn't just go pale, it went gray. Detective Miller turned to me. "Arthur, why don't you explain to your family what Marcus Thorne found in the basement of that shell company in Jersey?" I stepped forward, regaining the authority I used to hold in the surgical theater. "Julian didn't just lose money in trades, Madeline. He and Dr. Harrison Wells have been running a guardianship mill. They target wealthy retirees, use Wells to falsify a diagnosis of dementia or cognitive decline, and then use Julian's boutique firm to seize control of the assets. They've done it to for families in the last 3 years." I looked at my daughter, the woman I mentioned earlier, Margaret Holloway. She was a retired school teacher. She had a $3 million estate. Julian and Wells had her declared incompetent within 6 months. She was in a low-grade care facility owned by a holding company tied to your name, Madeline. She died there alone while your son bought a new Porsche with her life savings. "That's a lie," Madeline hissed, though her eyes were darting toward the exit. "It's not a lie," Miller said. "We have the bank records. We have the emails between Julian and Dr. Wells discussing the dosage for Arthur. They weren't just going to rob you, Arthur. They were going to chemically induce the very symptoms they needed for the court order. They were going to turn you into a vegetable to get to the $15 million in your trust." The room went silent. Even the hum of the hospital vending machines seemed to die away. Catherine, who had been listening from the chairs, let out a broken sob. The betrayal wasn't just financial. It was a premeditated murder of the soul. "Victoria," I said, my voice cracking for the first time, "did you know about Margaret Holloway? Did you know people died so your husband could wear $5,000 suits?" Victoria crumbled. She fell into one of the plastic waiting room chairs, burying her face in her hands. "He said they were people with no families. He said we were just managing things they couldn't handle anymore. I didn't think. I didn't want to know. Ignorance is not a defense for conspiracy." Miller said coldly. She signaled to 2 uniformed officers standing by the doors. "Madeline Callahan, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, grand larceny, and endangerment. Your son will be processed as soon as the doctors clear him." As the handcuffs clicked around Madeline's wrists, she didn't look like a socialite anymore. She looked like what she was, a common thief who had been caught by a man she thought was too old to fight back. "This isn't over, Arthur," she screamed as they led her away. "You've destroyed your own daughter's life. How does that feel for a legacy?" I stood there, watching them go. I felt 68 years of weight on my shoulders, but for the first time in months, the fog was entirely gone. I looked at Victoria, who was now being read her rights by Miller. She wasn't being handcuffed, yet she was a person of interest, who was about to become a star witness, but the chasm between us was now wider than the ocean. "I didn't destroy her legacy, Madeline," I whispered to the empty hallway. "I just performed the surgery. I removed the cancer. Sometimes the patient doesn't look the same afterward." To the world, I was a retired surgeon settling into the slow rhythm of old age. To Julian, I was a mark, a fading mind with a bank account too large for its own good. But while Julian spent his days at his fake firm in the city, I was conducting the most important operation of my life. The preparation didn't happen in a hospital. It happened in a secure room in a nondescript building in Queens, the headquarters of Marcus Thorne. Thorne was a man who lived in the shadows, a former FBI field agent with a specialty in white-collar crime. He was the one who taught me that in the digital age, everyone leaves a trail of blood even if that blood is just zeros. And one's in a ledger. It started with the coffee, I told Detective Miller during one of our private briefings in April. Every Sunday, Julian would insist on making the espresso. He'd bring it to me with a smile. Within 20 minutes, my hands would shake. My thoughts would feel like they were mired in thick gray wool. I'm a surgeon, Sarah. I know what a natural decline feels like. This was chemical. Thorne had gone to work immediately, while I played the role of the confused old man at home, purposely forgetting where I parked the car or asking the same question twice to keep Julian confident. Thorne was deconstructing Julian's life. Look at this, Arthur, Thorne had said, pointing to a screen in his dark office. Julian isn't just broke. He's underwater. He's been using your name to co-sign short-term high-interest loans without your knowledge. He's forged your signature on 3 different intent-to-transfer documents. He was building a paper bridge to your wealth, and all he needed was a doctor to say you weren't fit to hold the pen anymore. That was when we discovered Dr. Harrison Wells. Wells was the scalpel in Julian's operation. He was a disgraced psychiatrist who specialized in expert testimony for guardianship cases. For a 20% cut of the seized assets, Wells would provide a diagnosis of early-onset Alzheimer's or acute dementia, backed by falsified brain scans. I spent May and June turning my own home into a surveillance hub. Thorne installed pinhole cameras in the library, the kitchen, and the study. We recorded the whispered conversations between Julian and Madeline as they sat on my patio, drinking my wine and planning which of my properties they would sell first. We move at the anniversary party. I heard Julian's voice through my headphones. One rainy Tuesday in June, with 200 people there, his episode will be public. No one will question the diagnosis if they all see him lose his mind in the middle of a toast. It's perfect. And Victoria, Madeline had asked. There was a long pause on the recording. She'll do what she's told. She likes the jewelry too much to ask where the money comes from. Hearing those words was like a physical blow to the stomach. But as a surgeon, you learn to ignore the pain to finish the procedure. I began my counter move. I didn't just gather evidence, I planted it. I created fake financial documents that showed I was moving all my assets into an offshore trust that only I could access. I knew Julian was snooping through my desk. I wanted him to panic. I wanted him to feel the walls closing in so he would rush his timeline. A desperate predator makes mistakes. I also reached out to the families of Julian's previous victims. I met with the grandson of Margaret Holloway. I sat in a diner in Brooklyn and listened to him describe how his grandmother, a vibrant woman who loved poetry, had been reduced to a drugged-out husk in a facility within weeks of Julian taking over. I promised him justice, I told Miller, but I told him he had to wait for the party. The final piece of the strategy was the deadly switch. I practiced that move in front of my mirror for hours. I studied sleight-of-hand videos. I learned how to use my body's center of gravity to create a bump that looked accidental, but was perfectly controlled. I needed Julian to drink his own poison. I needed the medical record to show that he was the one with the drug in his system. By the time the sun rose on the day of the anniversary, the operation was already 80% complete. The ballroom was the theater. The guests were the witnesses. Julian was the patient. And as I stood in that hospital hallway for months later, watching the police lead his mother away, I realized that the hardest part of the surgery wasn't the technical skill, it was the emotional endurance. I had saved my life, but I had had to watch my family die on the table to do it. The New York State Supreme Court building in Manhattan is an intimidating structure of granite and marble. As I walked up the steps, leaning slightly on my cane, not out of weakness, but as a reminder of the years I had defended, I felt the Eyes of the press on me. The Sterling anniversary scandal had become a national headline. Inside the courtroom, the air was cold and smelled of old paper and floor wax. I sat in the front row, Catherine's hand gripped tightly in mine. Across the aisle sat the defendants. Julian looked different. The tan had faded. The bespoke suits had been replaced by a cheap, ill-fitting gray blazer. Beside him, Madeline sat with her head held high, a mask of defiance still plastered on her face. Dr. Harrison Wells sat at the end of the table, his eyes fixed on the floor, the image of a man who knew his career was buried 6 feet under. "All rise," the bailiff intoned. The trial lasted 2 weeks, but for me, it was a blur of vindication. Detective Sarah Miller was the prosecution's star witness, but it was Marcus Thorne's digital forensic evidence that truly sealed their fate. Thorne presented a detailed map of the conspiracy. He showed the jury a sequence of events that left no room for accident. The most damning moment came on the 4th day. The prosecution played the audio recording Thorne had captured 48 hours before the party. The courtroom was silent, as Julian's voice filled the space, sounding cold and transactional. "The old man's heart is strong, but his mind is the target," Julian's voice echoed. "Once Wells signs the affidavit on Monday morning, we move the funds to the Caymans. By the time Victoria realizes what's happening, the estate will be a shell. She gets the house, we get the life." I felt Catherine's hand tremble. She hadn't heard that specific recording until that moment. The betrayal wasn't just against me. Julian had been planning to dump our daughter the moment the money was safe then. It was Victoria's turn. She walked to the stand, looking small and fragile. She didn't look at Julian. She didn't look at me. Under oath, she detailed the 3 years of emotional manipulation. She admitted to seeing the vial in Julian's hand at the party and doing nothing. She spoke of the supplements Julian had forced her to help administer. During our Sunday dinners, "Why didn't you stop him, Victoria?" the prosecutor asked softly. "Because he made me feel like I was the crazy one," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He told me my father was dying anyway. He told me he was the only one who could save us from ruin. I chose the man I loved over the man who raised me. It was the biggest mistake of my life." The jury didn't take long. When they returned after only 4 hours of deliberation, the atmosphere in the room was electric. On the count of attempted second-degree assault, we find the defendant, Julian Callahan, guilty. On the count of grand larceny and conspiracy to commit fraud, we find the defendant, Madeline Callahan, guilty. On the count of medical malpractice and falsifying state records, we find the defendant, Harrison Wells, guilty. Julian's head dropped into his hands. Madeline let out a sharp, audible gasp, finally realizing that her silk armor couldn't protect her from a prison cell. The judge didn't hold back during sentencing. Julian received 15 years in a maximum security facility. Madeline was given 12. Dr. Wells, whose history of victimizing the elderly was now fully exposed, was sentenced to 22 years. Victoria was given 3 years of probation and mandatory community service at a senior care advocacy center. It was a lenient sentence, bought by her testimony, but the true sentence was the look on her face as she watched her husband be led away in chains. As we exited the courtroom, a reporter shoved a microphone into my face. "Dr. Sterling, how does it feel to see justice served?" I stopped and looked into the camera. I thought of Margaret Holloway. I thought of the other families Julian had destroyed. "Justice is a surgical procedure," I said calmly. "It's painful, it's messy, and it leaves scars. But without it, the rot just keeps spreading." Today, the rot was removed. I walked away, not looking back. The trial was over, but the final part of my life was just beginning. 1 year has passed since the night the white roses at the Montauk Point Country Club were stained by the shattered glass of a poisoned toast. The Hamptons estate is quiet now. The Atlantic still beats against the shore, and the salt air still fills my study. But the atmosphere has changed. The tension that lived in the walls for those 4 months of the operation has evaporated, replaced by a somber, reflective peace. Catherine and I sit on the porch most evenings. We don't talk much about the trial anymore. We talk about the garden, the books we're finally reading, and the patience I saved over 40 years. She is stronger than I gave her credit for. Learning that her daughter was part of a plot to erase her husband nearly broke her. But she didn't shatter. She chose to stand by me, even as we both grieved the living. Victoria is a shadow in our lives. She calls once a month. Sometimes I pick up. Sometimes I let it go to voicemail. She is completing her probation. Working at a hospice in the city, she tells me she is trying to earn back her soul. I want to believe her. But as a surgeon, I know that some tissues once severed never truly knit back together perfectly. There is always scar tissue. There is always a loss of sensation. Maybe in another 5 years, I will be able to look at her without seeing the terror in her eyes from the hospital hallway. Maybe never. I spent a few hours this morning in my study, looking through a drawer. I keep locked. Inside is a stack of letters. They aren't from friends or colleagues. They are from strangers, the families of those Julian and Dr. Wells had targeted before they met me. The letter on top is from the grandson of Margaret Holloway. He wrote to tell me that with the evidence uncovered during my trial, the state was able to seize Julian's hidden assets and return nearly $2 million to the families he robbed. Margaret's family used the money to start a foundation for elderly protection. They named a wing of a local library after her. Reading that letter made the 3 months of playing a clumsy old man worth every second. I am 69 years old now. My joints creak a bit more, and I wake up slower than I used to. But my mind is sharp. My hands, though retired from the scalpel, are steady. I realize that Julian's greatest mistake wasn't greed. It was the same mistake many young people make. He looked at my gray hair and saw a sunset. He didn't realize that a sunset is just the prelude to the stars coming out, and some stars are bright enough to burn you. I recently sat down to record a video message for a national senior advocacy group. I didn't talk about surgery. I talked about vigilance. They will tell you that you are past your prime, I said into the camera, my voice echoing the authority of the OR. They will tell you that your assets are too much for you to manage, that your memory is a sieve, and that you should step aside. Listen to your instincts. If something feels like a trap, it usually is. And never, ever assume that because a man has put down his tools, he has forgotten how to use them. I closed the laptop and walked into the kitchen. Catherine had made tea. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the New York sky in shades of bruised purple and gold. "Are you coming to bed, Arthur?" she asked, her hand resting on my shoulder. "In a moment," I said. "I just want to watch the light fade." I stood there for a long time. I thought about the man in the expensive suit who thought he could steal my life with a white tablet. He is sitting in a gray cell now, eating off a plastic tray, counting the days until he is middle-aged. And I am here, on my porch, with my wife and my dignity. The operation was a success. The patient, my life is in full recovery. I folded my hands, felt the strength still lingering in my fingers, and followed my wife into the warmth of our home. The lights in the house went out, one by one, until only the moonlight remained, reflected on the calm, dark surface of the sea. If you like history, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.